Welcome to the Unitarian Christian Alliance Podcast, Episode 68, Pictures and Missions, with Levi Gelineau. I'm Mark Kane. Today we learn a little bit more about the Christadelphians, a group which started in the 1800s and which hold a Unitarian view of God. They are effectively restorationists, as are many who find their way into the UCA. Note, I didn't capitalize restorationist there. I'm not sure if you heard that. I'm using it as a simple adjective for people who look back to the earliest believers, then look around, then look back again, and realize something isn't quite right. A restorationist desires to remove things which don't belong in the faith today, and to return to things which do. Naturally, the creedal wonders of the 3rd and 4th centuries don't quite fall into the what the apostles taught category, despite the emphatic confidence of 3 out of every 4 commenters on our YouTube videos. Last episode, I talked about the power of tradition. Perhaps this is a surprise, but even groups which are based on apostolic examples and patterns will eventually have their own traditions that aren't biblical. Decisions made a century ago for practical reasons may still be followed today because that's just the way we've always done it. Tradition is sticky like that. Now, you might be of the most forthright restorationist mindset, and you desire to restore all that has been warped. Consequently, maybe you find all organized groups distasteful. You may even find disorganized groups distasteful. I get where you're coming from. But may I suggest some grace here? Actually, I'm not just going to ask for you to have some grace. I need all of us to take a breath and find some grace. There will always be some organizational elements that form within a group of people if they have to work together. Once there is an organization, there will be practices. Practices become traditions, and tradition becomes important. This can be discouraging to you in your staunchly restorationist mindset. Here is where we need some grace. If you belong to a group that has been around a while, recognize that you probably have rules, both spoken and unspoken, rules which have become a part of the fabric of your group. Maybe in an effort to not look like the world, certain kinds of clothing were encouraged. Over time, that intent to not be a part of the world morphed into the way to outwardly demonstrate your commitment to the group, a dress code of sorts. It became expected. When you didn't dress properly, people talked about you. Maybe you would be quietly, or not so quietly, instructed to change your behavior. So eventually, a practice forms and it takes on a life of its own. No one in your church can quote the passage which says, "Modest women wear denim skirts." But if you showed up dressed otherwise, you felt the pressure. It's like you were going against God. I propose that this is just how we are. It's the power of identifying with your community, of belonging. And it's the natural process of practices becoming internal traditions, traditions which become part of the denim fabric of your church. So why do we need some grace? So we can recognize the potential harm our traditions may be causing. Do you want to reject people from your restorationist church because they are failing to live up to your man-made internal traditions? That's hypocritical. It's counter to the spirit of restorationism that you claim. Do you want to shoot down ideas from your energetic youth because we don't do things that way? Youth can recognize hypocrisy as well as adults can, and they may be more than happy to use it as an excuse to leave. We who fellowship in groups need grace to recognize that some of what we do may not be prescribed by the New Testament. Some of what we get irritated by, pouty-faced and upset about, shouldn't really matter in the least. We can loosen our white-knuckled grip on some things and just trust God. Here, every group that's been together for more than a decade probably has peculiarities. And with your discerning and critical restorationist eye, I bet you could nail them for it. Tell them why they are wrong. Wipe the dust from your feet and move on. You, after all, are looking for a true New Testament church, not this apostasy. Well, maybe you'll find a true church. Maybe you'll start it. And maybe you'll somehow manage to never develop any non-apostolic behaviors or practices. I wish you well. But it may be an impossible task. See, the apostles didn't make a point of documenting all the proper ways to do groups. Sometimes it seems they just did things because it made sense for the needs at hand. Grace and understanding will help us here. If you're a part of a group and your group intends to grow, to find others, to reach the lost, you need grace to recognize your own peculiarities and to recognize when those practices may be off-putting to outsiders. Let your love for others outshine your adherence to your traditions. If you are isolated and looking for a group to fellowship with, grace can help you see why some things seem to be a bit overly important to them. Don't react too quickly or judge them harshly. Maybe several folks in the group recognize the issue, but haven't been able to articulate it yet, and maybe your fresh perspective and joy to just be there can help warm a few hearts. Being a part of a group is hard. They are, after all, made up of humans. And where I attend, sometimes a dog or two. Willa and Layla, if your humans are listening, they owe you an extra treat for making it onto a podcast. Life is hard too. There's an obvious value to communities of faith, especially if times get hard. And if you watch or read the news, you may have noticed the potential for life-altering disruption seems just around the corner. Maybe you're already living in the midst of political, economic, or natural disaster misery. If you have the opportunity to meet others, give them a chance with grace. We Christians are commanded to help each other, and in hard times, we may be the only help that's available. If you're part of a group, give the newcomers grace and love. When you talk about how you do things in your church, be mindful that some of it is just your own traditions. Be open about that. Be honest and transparent. Maybe even chuckle about it. Hopefully your new friends can recognize your spirit of love and find grace for managing your peculiarities. The Christadelphians have well past a century of history, and each local group, as you'll hear today, is quite independent. Some may not be very comfortable with newcomers popping in. Others may love it. It just depends. I want to encourage you to visit and meet people. You may never fully fit into a group that's just too different from you, but you may make some wonderful friends. And you won't have to hear sermons about God dying, which is always a good thing. I was on Levi's podcast a few weeks back. After the interview today, I'll reflect on that experience and some of the encouraging things that have resulted. Now, let me introduce you to a fellow podcaster, cut from a similar batch of cloth perhaps, and to the global work of the Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation. Well, Levi Gelineau, tell me a little bit about your background, and then we'll move on to the WCF.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Levi. I live here in Southern California. Right now, I'm at my office in Burbank, California. I go to our Ecclesia, as we call them, here in Simi Valley. I was born and raised Christadelphian. Like anyone who's born into a faith, I chose to be baptized when I was a teenager, but my faith kind of really became real, had my conversion at a different time.
Yeah.
And I have a wife and two daughters, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, so I haven't slept for 11 months.
Very good. Yeah, I'm like you, born into a Unitarian faith and grew up in it. So the Christadelphians call their groups Ecclesias. That's from the Greek word.
That's correct, yeah. Just personally, I refer to it as church to my children.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people who call it church. Also, meeting is a common phrase we use. My ecclesia is called the Simi Hills Ecclesia.
Okay. About how many people do you have there in your ecclesia?
Simi Hills is one of the larger ecclesias in Southern California, and Southern California is one of the more populous areas for Christadelphians.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm saying that, and these numbers might not be that impressive, but our ecclesia's got about 100 baptized individuals.
Okay.
And we'll have attendance of around 150, 170. And there's 13 ecclesias in Southern California.
Oh.
So that's nice. We have a wonderful pocket of the community, but like you're aware, I mean, in Ohio, there's one technically Christadelphian ecclesia and one Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith ecclesia, which we are very, very close and have many unity agreements. But
yeah.
That's more the norm in the States and in Canada. There'll be one within a couple hundred miles of each other. But in Southern California, we have about 500 to 700 Christadelphians altogether.
Okay. Well, it's funny when you were saying, like, I don't know if this number will be impressive, but 100 people, I'm like, well, remember, Levi, you're talking to folks, many of whom are looking around like within 50 miles and saying, can I find anyone?
Yeah. Yes, that's a good point.
100 people is a really good crowd of folks, so that's nice.
And it's a very loving ecclesia. I think there's a lot of good focus on taking care of each other and compromising with each other. So yeah, I'm very blessed.
I wanted to talk a little bit about WCF, or Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation. Mm-hmm. They've been a sponsor twice at the Unitarian Christian Alliance conferences. You know, a lot of people still don't really understand what it is that they do. And I think one of the reasons that it's a little confusing is when you have a group like the Christadelphians, which is decentralized to a very high degree, mm-hmm. it can be a little bit confusing. So keep in mind that folks may not grasp how a non-organized group still has organizations that work this way.
Yeah, we are incredibly decentralized. Ecclesial autonomy is something that was really important to the individuals who founded Christadelphia in the 1850s. 1848 was the first speaking tour of Dr. John Thomas, he didn't know it at the time, but eventually formed the Christadelphian faith. Ecclesial autonomy was very important to them in their early writings. It continues to be important to Christadelphians. And what's funny is I'd actually say some of the most extreme kind of conservative Christadelphians would say that organizations like the WCF or the magazines or the Christadelphian Bible Missions, which are a couple organizations that are specifically chartered for preaching and conversions, mm-hmm. all of those are they actually should not exist because they are extra ecclesial organizations, which is a pretty funny thing to get in an email sometime.
So the UCA would be out too, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So anything that's outside of just the purview of a single church. Anyways, okay. That shows, I think, the spirit that our sect has of a real passion for no central leadership. But that being said, WCF, which is the Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation, was started in the 1960s. There's a specific conference that we hold in Williamsburg, Virginia. It's called the Williamsburg Conference. It's held to this day. It's a lovely gathering, by the way, if you're ever in Williamsburg, Virginia at the end of the year. It's held up to the New Year's Day, so it's late December. But in the 60s, early 70s, I'm fuzzy on the dates, and it's actually not on our website, which it probably should be. There was a group of Christadelphian men who felt that there should be an organization that funds preaching activities and ecclesial development activities. And preaching was the big focus at that time. Currently, WCF has a lot more of a church building focus in North America and around the world, but a lot more kind of inward looking and providing resources to ecclesias here in the States and Canada.
Okay.
But we're going to talk more about this. But my specific role with WCF is I volunteer as the team lead for our Whitefields program. And Whitefields is essentially our funding arm for preaching activities. Obviously, a reference to Mark 16, the fields are white for harvest.
So when you say preaching activities, would that be like missionary trips? I mean,
the arm that I work in at WCF funds preaching activities in the States as well as abroad.
Within churches or outside of churches?
Yeah, within churches or church building with the goal of church building. So going to a place where there are no churches or the individuals at the churches want to increase their public-facing activities. And WCF looks at those applications, works with those individuals and sees if it's something that we can fund. WCF is obviously sponsored entirely by Christadelphian donations.
Okay, well, that helps make sense of it. So I met some folks from the WCF at the Unitarian Christian Alliance. They were sponsors the first year, and they were sponsors the second year. I now have some friends because of this, and some who even live close to me. I was asked, how did WCF find out about the Unitarian Christian Alliance? Well, it was through Steve Snobelen, who Dale Tuggy knew, We were looking for people to present at the first conference, and Steve Snobelen presented on Paul Best, who was one of the historical figures who was a Unitarian Christian who met his demise. Steve is more known for his work on Isaac Newton, but most of us hadn't heard of Paul Best, so it was really cool to have Steve there. WCF came. Obviously, if they're part of preaching and they're part of funding efforts like that, it's clear that they have a outward kind of see what we can do, make some connections, influence, and be helpful to others.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an aligned mission, and you were a guest on my podcast. We'll talk more about podcasts later. And you explained some of the mission of the UCA, and I think the idea of just making connections for Unitarians is totally within the mission of WCF. I want to tell a story about Steve Snobelen, which you can include or not include on the podcast. And you mentioned his study of Sir Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
And he's really the world's leader on Isaac Newton's theology, because Isaac Newton actually wrote more about theology than he did about science.
Wow.
He's obviously famous for the discovery, quote unquote, of gravity.
Yes.
So Steve actually attended our Ecclesia for a year. Him and his family were in Southern California for a year because he was taking a sabbatical and studying at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. And he was studying the collection of books that Isaac Newton owned, which is held at the Huntington Library.
Oh,
okay.
Okay.
What he was studying specifically for a year is the dog ears in Isaac Newton's books. So for a whole year, he was leafing through Isaac Newton's personal book collection, noting where the dog ears were and what information was contained on that page.
Mm-hmm.
And then...
Wait, people might not know what a dog ear is. Okay.
So dog ear is when on your book you fold the corner over.
Yes.
I'm moving my hands as if this is a video, and it's not. You fold the corner over to save the page for reference for later.
Yes.
Okay?
Okay.
So there was... I'm going to make up the number, but it was somewhere between 60 and 70. Let's say there were 70 books.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Snobelen goes through them, notes all the dog ears, and then he actually examined like 20 other books that the library had found at the same time and argued that one of those books, the dog ear pattern was the same, and said this must have also been Isaac Newton's book. Congratulations, you have 71 books. Anyways, I think it's just so he's obviously he's a genius, in the education field and a lecturer, has worked at many universities, but I just think as a for us mortals, it's really hard to imagine studying the book collection, not even Sir Isaac Newton's writings, just his books. Anyways,
that's remarkable.
That aside was worth it, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Well, when you say he's the leading expert on Sir Isaac Newton, well then, studying the dog ears, I'm like, well, of course, he would be the one to do that, not me.
Correct. He's the one qualified to do that. So I'll hard shift out of that story. There's really no
Sure.
other way, because I don't know how we walk out of that one. I wanted to read, this is from WCF's website, which is wcfoundation.org, their current mission statement. Here it is. The Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation is a nonprofit foundation that helps individuals and families grow their faith in God and His Son, now and for generations to come. That's it. The same kind of core has been together for the last 5-6 years, and they've really turned a focus just simply on building faith, building belief, which then that makes it a pretty broad mission.
Yeah.
Right? So international and domestic preaching efforts, but also the upliftment and education of our own, our youth or our own members who have faith struggles for all sorts of different reasons.
No, that's good. The organization itself, like how many people actually work within the organization, either volunteers or not?
It's a good question. I'll ballpark that. I would say between 20 and 35. So There's about 5 or 6 directors. Well, there's one full-time person, and then maybe 5 to 7 part-time who charge organization for their time based on their specific skills.
Okay.
And then there's probably about 10, 15, 20 volunteers after that. That's not counting our international missionaries, for lack of a better word. So in 2023, we're looking at sponsoring or partially sponsoring almost 45, 50 people to all sorts of different countries.
You mentioned countries, so I imagine it's like different mission works. There's probably some stories, some interesting details there.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I sent you a picture for the cover of this podcast, and it's a baptism that's happening in Cambodia. We're actually in cooperation with the Australian Christadelphian Bible Mission for the mission work that's being done in Cambodia. And Cambodia has been really rocked by the pandemic and government issues, but they've completely reopened to travel. And so we're sending a bunch of volunteers there and hoping to kind of regain ground lost and continue the growth of our churches there. But also we have missionaries currently in South Africa, and we sponsor programs in the Philippines. And actually those sponsored missionaries in South Africa and the Philippines and in India are all local missionaries, so not Westerners, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
We found that to be the most effective, is to support individuals who are from the country for all sorts of cultural reasons.
It makes sense.
Another thing we have is we actually have we support a program in Vietnam, which this has been interesting because it is illegal to preach any sort of Christian doctrines in Vietnam or Pakistan. So it's interesting because WCF, we have a pretty good social media presence and newsletters and all this, and we actually don't discuss the support for the programs in Vietnam or Pakistan for the safety of the individuals that are there, which is hard to imagine. We, as comfortable people here in the United States, totally able to worship freely, hard to compare.
I mean, just you saying that here on the podcast won't get anybody in trouble, will it?
No, because there's no individuals to talk about.
Okay.
We're not using any names or pictures or anything.
Okay.
And I kind of came to this job because I was a volunteer through White Fields, technically. My wife and I went to India in 2010 for 7 months. And I have a cool story I could tell you about that, actually, from an experience that we had there.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so we were staying at what's called a hostel, a youth hostel, but it's different than how we use that term. In India, there will be these homes for children who live in villages, essentially, not in main cities. We were in Hyderabad, India, and these children will either be majorly economically held back or be orphaned or have parents with major medical issues who can't support the children. And they'll come and stay at these hostels. So the Christadelphians have 3 separate hostel programs that are supported by Christadelphian donors. And Whitefield sponsored my wife and I to go to India to support one of these hostels with English and spiritual education.
Okay.
So while we were there, which there's a million stories, just life in such a totally different culture.
I can imagine.
We became close with a lady who was on staff there. She was one of the cooks. And she asked if we would do Bible classes with her. What was unique and really impactful to my wife and I's faith is Lakshmi was illiterate. So how do you teach the truth of the Bible or God's message, or really anything, to someone who is illiterate and doesn't speak your language?
Oh.
Right? So
okay.
We brought in a translator, so there was another one of the employees there who could translate English into Telugu. And then my wife would just draw pictures of essentially the Christadelphian doctrines, and I would explain them and read passages about them.
Okay.
And we ended up with this picture book, essentially, of our theology.
Okay.
in different picture forms.
And you left that with her. That became kind of like a Bible, a study book for her.
Yeah. So
wow.
She had no contact, no way to read, and she still attends the meeting. She can listen and understand anything. It is how Jesus would have taught, which is interesting, right? They can't really consult scriptures that, for many thousands of years, people couldn't look up the Bible, right?
Right. They'd have to go to the synagogue to have access to a scroll.
Right.
Yeah.
So we kind of returned to that form of teaching in kind of pictures and stories, and even lying down and standing up, lying down as if I was dead and standing up as if I was resurrected, which I think is just amazing. Yeah. So yeah, that was fascinating.
Did you take pictures of it so that you would have your own copy? Because you left it there, right?
We left it there, and I should ask Jess if we did. A project that's been kicking around in our minds ever since is working with actual illustrators and making that kind of book. Like the Christadelphians, like us, we have a statement of faith, and there's 28 tenets on that. Mm-hmm. It'd be pretty cool to have 28 pictures, right, that go with that.
That's, I'm thinking if you don't have an illustrator or you don't have somebody interested in it, you've just now tapped into an entire new world of people by saying that out loud. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll find somebody who's like, I'll do it.
I would love for someone to take that idea. Absolutely. We do not own that idea. I would love to see that happen. And WCF might sponsor you if that's something that you would need.
Wow. Would it be as official as King James English? I'm just not sure.
Well,
Okay.
it'd be really hard to find the root words, that's for sure.
Amazing. And so she still attends to this day. Like she's a part of the group there?
Yeah, as far as I understand. Yeah. So definitely a neat experience for us. And I think anyone who's listening now and who's done any sort of foreign missionary work or travel, knows that there's such an impact on the traveler, the person who's there as a missionary.
Yes.
Even whatever impact on the people that they meet with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm still thinking about this. Because, what we say now, we're like, well, you should go study the scriptures and study this to show yourself as a good student. Study to show thyself approved.
Right.
Well, you can't read. That puts a slowdown in the study, the scripture process.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, if you think back to how it was, like especially at the beginning of the dawn of the church, the number of people who had scriptures to study was still low. They had to go places where they had them.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't just go pick up a copy of the scroll. Some of those things took months to create at the hands of scribes who were not cheap.
Yeah.
That was a process.
My wife, after the India trip, well, she'd been to Jamaica before, but then she went back to Jamaica and met with two Christadelphian sisters there who also couldn't read, but they had an incredible amount of scripture memorized. So they would quote passages. So yeah, obviously these people who can't read, they adapt and learn purely through auditory learning.
I like auditory learning.
Yeah.
I'm a fan.
We're doing some auditory learning right now.
Yes, we are. Well, your role with WCF includes something dear to my heart. You also have a podcast.
That's right.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, we had our annual meeting, powwow. We got together last October in Richmond, and I'm kind of one of the only ones with two roles.
Okay.
One of them is the Whitefields team lead. I do volunteer recruitment and help flesh out proposals so we can approve those. Yeah, my other job is I'm the host of one of WCF's podcasts, but kind of our flagship general show, which we call A Little Faith. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts, A Little Faith. The last episode will be Mark Kane.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, if you look now. But yeah, it's a very general show with kind of the mission of just telling different stories about faith and what affects people's faith. So it can be pretty broad. We discuss a book that a brother has written, or we discuss some sort of story of recovery. There's another one of my favorite ones is the episode of Peter Clausen. He was a beautiful pianist, and music had always been his passion. And he has a massive stroke, and in the recovery of that, talked about what it felt like for music to come back. For a period of time, he couldn't move one of his hands, and playing piano with one hand, and the emotions and the spiritual lessons of how that goes. So it's a very broad show. The name,
though, A Little Faith. I think I know what it is, but go ahead and explain why that's the name.
Yeah, I think that's all we're hoping for is a little faith, is a little belief and just that little bit. And I think that's, again, the drive of the show is to affect people's faith. That's the drive of LWCF, to increase faith and devotion.
In a way, your podcast then is kind of similar to mine in that it involves a lot of people, a lot of stories.
Yeah, I think we are similar shows, and we're also kind of the podcast of a larger organization.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, the podcast has been running since the end of 2019.
Okay.
And there's other hosts. I've had different co-hosts in the past. I'm the only one who's been consistent through the whole thing. And I started it because I had started another podcast before that, which is still going. So I'm the host of two podcasts, but I work with two other individuals, and the show's just ours. We're not technically attached to any other Christadelphian organization. But that podcast is called Good Christadelphian Talks. And Good Christadelphian Talks is just a weekly show that replays a lecture or a sermon or an exhortation, as we call them. So Christadelphians call sermons exhortations because we just have to rename everything to make sure we're not identified as any other church. So,
I see. Okay.
So Good Christadelphian Talks is just a show where we amplify essentially a talk that someone had suggested to us. It's in the idea that Christadelphians have hundreds of talks. You go on YouTube, or we have websites where all the recordings are on, all the way back to the 80s and even before that. So there's infinite content, but it's just the idea that it's being suggested. So a couple of us were at a men's retreat, like a men's camping weekend, and we were talking just in a circle, and we said, I listen to a talk if someone emails it to me every time. Like even if you, Mark, if you sent me a lecture from whatever and said, hey, this was great, I'm very likely going to listen to it.
Word of mouth. Yeah.
So that show's been really successful. Actually, our metrics on that show are amazing. And we think it's almost like 15-20% of English-speaking Christadelphians listen to it, which is a lot. So it's like,
wow,
we get up to 3,000 listeners in some cases.
Wow.
That's been a really interesting show because I think there's clearly been a market for that. So I would suggest that too for anyone who, especially like the real hardcore podcast listeners who run out of podcasts. I know the feeling as a hardcore podcast listener myself. You run out of podcasts sometimes in your queue and you're at empty. What do I do? And you get,
what do I do?
If you want to, you can go to Good Christadelphian Talks, and
yeah.
I can tell you that there's some good lectures on there.
How many episodes of that one are there?
Oh man. I just posted the 226th episode last Sunday.
Okay.
So we've been doing that since I think October of 2018. And during the pandemic, we actually moved to twice a week. We didn't have anything else to do. So
right.
we increased it.
Yeah, I'm very interested in podcasts, and I had a teaching about podcasts at the last UCA conference, and I'm now talking to people about getting podcasts started. And your 2 podcasts are examples of kinds of podcasts. It's important for people who are thinking, oh, I might want to do something someday, to recognize the breadth of possibilities. Mm-hmm. What you do for the podcast, A Little Faith, is sort of like what I do. There's something you want to talk about, you get somebody, you have an interview, and then it becomes a program.
Right.
But what you've did for Good Talks is repurpose existing content that was already recorded.
Totally.
And I've explained to people, this is a nifty way to do things if the content you're using is actually meaningful to people.
Mm-hmm.
What I like about what you did in your repurposing is you talk about it as it goes into it, and you discuss it again at the end. And I think that gives it a bit of a personal touch, because, I mean, you could just go straight up, here's the next episode from so-and-so, and boom, go right into it. I mean, it would still be a great lecture, perhaps, but I think that little extra touch is nice. It's not a lot of time that you have to commit to it, but it makes it more personable, and they get to kind of meet you in the process. Yeah. I think that's nice.
Yeah, and I think it's worked out really well with having co-hosts, too. So we're up to 3. And we get feedback that, you know, people like certain hosts over others, which is obviously human.
Yeah.
So,
well, since a vast majority of our listeners are not Christadelphians, and, well, they're not much of anything. I mean, even within the UCA directory, the majority of people are either other, none, or left blank.
Interesting.
And that's more than half of them. So we're well past 1,000 people who've entered into the directory at this point. And more than half of them have no stated affiliation at all, which means, you know, they could be hearing about this for the first time through you right now. In the case of your podcast, though, knowing that many who are listening aren't even Christadelphians, is your podcast like really geared toward Christadelphians? Like this might be confusing for people who aren't? Would it?
I think A Little Faith would be totally open for non-Christadelphian listeners. That's the WCF podcast. Good Christadelphian Talks, there probably would be a little bit more like Christadelphianisms, for lack of a better term, that might be harder to understand. But the one thing which I would credit our community to is sometimes our lectures and our talks and sermons err on too much scriptural quotes. So if you wanted to approach any of those episodes or lectures, I could guarantee that there'd be a lot of Bible passages. So also we actually list when we post the episodes, we actually put in the description exhortation, if it is an exhortation. That is a specific Sunday morning sermon service. If you know that little clue, you can select something that might be more of a lecture, right? That's on a specific topic. Like the one I just posted last Sunday was on, it's a collection of all the stories that happened on the Sea of Galilee, which is cool. It's a fun study to do. The exhortations are much more specific about the role that Jesus played in his life and death and resurrection. They're kind of more churchy, I guess, is what I'm saying, for people who... So if that's what you're looking for, you know, so if that's what you'd like on a Sunday morning, then that's why we note them as exhortation, because we actually have many Christadelphians who live in isolation, as we call it, and they use our podcast on Sunday mornings as their sermon.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I love about any podcast that has hundreds of episodes, you have the option to just search through the list, scroll through the list, and find things that might actually be in something you've been interested in.
Yes.
The resources that exist out there are amazing. You know, I love that we have people producing things, gathering things. Like the organization that I belong to, the Church of God General Conference, just recently started a podcast too called ABC's Class from the Past. ABC is the Bible college that our conference has, and they've had some recordings of teachers giving a lecture. And so they've taken that recording and they've repurposed it exactly like you're doing,
Oh, nice.
and they've made it a podcast. Like Alva Huffer, he has a book called Systematic Theology. They had recorded one of his classes somewhere in the 2000s, and that's now actually released as a part of the series. So I think people who have access to that kind of content, this is a good way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chance that you could bring something to the table that might have otherwise stayed hidden or might not be available. It's worth thinking through.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're in the exact best time to be creating content for consumption. It's never been easier. I mean, you and I have day jobs, and through practice and the right equipment, you can put out really good work that can be really helpful to people.
Yeah. I'm still thinking about your picture book. I'm thinking through theology and what picture would represent atonement. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really fun challenge. Like resurrection's kind of an easy one, right? It's like, oh well, or the kingdom of God, that's easy, but
yeah. How
do you explain, grace or
grace? Oh man. Anyway. Well, Levi, this has been fantastic. I so appreciate that we've gotten to talk, and I thank you for even taking the time to interview me for A Little Faith.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's been a real treat to have this time together and to talk about these things. I hope that the partnership between WCF and the UCA will continue for many years as we kind of see this movement grow, as it should.
All right. Take care. Thank you, Levi.
Yep. Have a good night.
I'm so thankful that I've gotten to know Levi, and not just him, but many who come from the Christadelphian background. After appearing on his podcast, A Little Faith, there was an increase in people putting their little spots on the UCA map. Many Christadelphians who followed Levi had not yet heard about what was going on here. In our interview, I spoke about what the UCA is, and what our goals are, and what they aren't. If you still aren't sure what the UCA is all about, are we a new denomination? Are we intending to garner all the power of Unitarianism for ourselves? Or are we a competitive cheerleading team with a biblical slant? I'd suggest listening to Levi and I. It's the episode from January 24th, 2023. And that other story that Levi mentioned, that of Peter Clausen and how music played a part in his recovery, that's the episode from June 8th, 2021. That's on my list now. And after this episode is released, I plan to give it a listen. Oh, and another connection through these efforts. I'm intending to learn about some schools that the Christadelphians have founded, not colleges, but for younger kids. As you may be aware, schooling, like who's really in charge and what is the curriculum, etc., that kind of thing is a touchy topic here in the 2020s. I hope to learn about their efforts. And if all goes well, yeah, you guessed it. Am I that predictable? If all goes well, I hope to have a future episode about their schools. In March, there are events in New York and Indiana. In April, Texas, New York, and Tennessee, plus a trip to Israel. In July, a youth event in Indiana and a family camp in Oregon State, and that's the Western Christadelphian Bible School. If you're out that way, now you know a bit more about them. Also a reminder that I'll be at the Texas event in April to talk about hosting regional UCA conferences and to meet Texas folks, naturally. Learn about all of this at UnitarianChristianAlliance.org/events. Opening up the mailbag, Ken writes in response to the previous episode, episode 67, Why is the Trinity Mainstream? Mark, just adding to your Empire information, one thing that I came across just before my deep dive, and it smoothed the way, was reading a history book called The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, which is about the history of commerce through the ages. When the author was covering the Roman Empire, he made an interesting observation that during the time of Emperor Theodosius, it was made law under the pain of death or exile to teach anything other than the Trinity in all the Roman lands. This caused a flood of Unitarian Christians out of the empire and into the East, especially Persia, because Persia was sympathetic, or perhaps apathetic, to alternative religions. That was until the rise of Muhammad, some 500 years later, who first welcomed and then killed the Christians and Jews of Persia. Thank you, Ken. There have always been believers in the one single God of Isaac and Jacob and Abraham, and in his servant, Jesus the Messiah. They've persisted through the ages. Many of them, as you note, ended up driven from their own lands. Not an easy trip in those days. It would have been easier to just change your beliefs. Imagine if that was our choice. Become Trinitarian or take your things and move to a foreign land. On foot, or maybe donkey. Definitely not U-Haul. Well, people did this in droves because of truth and their conscience. That's amazing. Oh, and Patricia adds this about that same episode. Hi, Mark. Once you set an idea in motion, it takes on a life of its own. History is full of this concept. Advertising experts know this and make a lot of money with this idea. This world is full of lies that people believe. Thanks, Patricia. That is so true. You just have to get an idea into someone's head, make them feel something, like feeling part of something bigger than themselves, or feel like they are right, and then the long, painful process of undoing the damage can begin. Stephanie Schlegel, episode 12, An American in Messianic Israel, also enjoyed the Trinity mainstream episode. Mark, excellent. Good analogy that the organic homegrown faith farms were driven out by the religious industrial complex. The fruit was sprayed and spoiled. I'm adding this, GMO, God-modified organism, and the harm that comes from bio-counseled creeds. Yes, we are a small, organic, non-GMO farm community. Thanks, Stephanie. There were adequate analogies in that episode, but John Lawson, episode 32, Negotiating with Trinitarians, still keeps the trophy. I'm a mere Padawan at the feet of John's Jedi analogy mastery.
Once you start down the analogy path, forever it will dominate your destiny. Consume you it will.
There are many of you who are working your way through some of the past episodes. M.N. wrote this on Hildy Chandler's series, episodes 2 through 4. Love this series from Hildy. Thank you so much. I would love to hear Kegan's testimony on how he came to the truth and also his take on when he talked to his parents. M.N. Thank you so much. I entirely agree. In fact, I've been tentatively planning an interview with Kegan about this for wait, let me check. I've had it on my to-do list for about 15 months now. He's had a lot of things pop up in his life, so I'm waiting until I know I have his undivided attention. He's agreed to do it, just to understand that Kegan is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he's just plain busy. 2 Mark 6:32. So get yourself into the mailbag by writing me, podcast@UnitarianChristianAlliance.org. I also gladly accept audio clips, like what Kristen did for the question in the last episode. A reminder that we do have a UCA Twitter account, @UnitarianChrist. Also a reminder that I've been putting real chapter markers in these episodes. If you've used them and feel like giving me feedback, please do. Some podcast players let you see the chapters right while it's playing, and you can jump to different sections. Here in this podcast, you can use the chapter markers to jump past all the advertisements for Dallas Theological Seminary and Legionnaires polling services that I shove in at the beginning. Glad I can help. Oh, 2 more presentation videos have been released since last episode. Dustin Smith's The Plural of Majesty and Sam Tiedemann's Christology, Worship, and the Eucharist. Should we worship Jesus? Links are in the show notes, or just go to YouTube and search for Unitarian Christian Alliance. You can find them and more right there. I think this episode would be encouraging to folks who may be leaning toward a more abysmal view of the world. It's uplifting to see groups actively involved in work around the world for the sake of truth and for God's kingdom. Maybe share this with someone who needs a smile. Thank you, Levi, and thank you to all of you at the Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation. Your support means so much. I wish you all well in your ministries and especially in the humanitarian work that you're involved in. The world needs more light. May God bless you in your truth pursuits. I hope this podcast serves you well.